This is Joe Delio from the live community, bringing you a GlobalProtect Agent Setting CIS Controls webinar, brought to you by David Cumbow, Aaron McAllister, Shane Markley, and Dan Smith. I now hand off to David.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Week, what, 5 of quarantine, I think, for many of us. So very interesting times that we're going through, and we appreciate you taking time out of your busy days to join us and go through this GlobalProtect Agent Settings and CIS Controls webinar. My name is David Cumbow. I'm going to be hosting the webinar for you today. Today we have Dan Smith, one of our SEs out of Southern California, Shane Markley, one of our SEs out of Las Vegas, as well as Aaron McAllister, one of our SEs out of Colorado, joining us today to provide some content and help answer questions. So as with all the other webinars, I will be providing a PDF version of this at the end of this webinar that will be sent out to you, as well as these recordings will be on the live community YouTube channel, as well as a post with all the Q&A will be on the live community here, probably about a week after the last webinar, which is on Thursday. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Next slide, please, Dan. Thanks, sir. So what we're specifically going to be talking about today is keeping security top of mind, right? Many of us may have gone through and in a rush to enable that business continuity, in a rush to get that those remote workers up and running, maybe have put security on the back burner, or maybe have implemented other solutions where security might not be the forefront of that solution. So, why do we need to keep security top of mind? We'll be chatting about that. Then we'll start diving into the GlobalProtect agent configurations and best practices, specifically around the GlobalProtect agent. This was one of the #1 topics that was requested during the last set of webinars. We'll take that and now then turn into why are the CIS security controls specific around GlobalProtect? What does that enable? As well as some remote worker and home CIS controls that are out there that you may or may not be aware of. And then, of course, as with every webinar, we're going to have Q&A. So please do utilize the Q&A functionality of Zoom. We will be sure to get to all your questions. And with that being said, next slide, please, Dan. So as many of you know, and if you follow any kind of security news, you're very much aware that there is definitely risk out there. And I hope I'm preaching to the choir here, but I kind of bring this up as just helping us keep it top of mind, right? As we take and move our critical assets, our access to our critical assets from trusted on-premise networks to users that are remote, there's a whole new level of security challenges. The beautiful part about GlobalProtect in general is the fact that GlobalProtect takes that security posture that you build on-premise and extends it out to wherever your remote workers may go. But as you can see from some of these headlines, some of these I pulled today, some of these I pulled when I was building the presentation a couple of weeks ago. You'll see that there is security challenges out there, and threat actors, no shame in their game. They definitely go through and will take advantage of that. Next slide, please. So, this is why just my kind of ask for you is don't forget about security. If you looked at another product, if you're not utilizing GlobalProtect today, or if you are utilizing GlobalProtect, keep in mind some of the 3 major factors that you can actually utilize, right? First and foremost, you get to maintain that visibility you have as if those users were on premise. So all the wonderful app ID, SSL decryption, antivirus, anti-spyware, file blocking, data filtering, URL filtering, DNS security subscriptions, all of those follow your end users when you enable them with GlobalProtect. And because of that, you have simplified security. If you go through and you create an amazing security posture on premise, there's no reason that that security posture shouldn't follow your end users as they go off premise. And then the nice part about GlobalProtect as well is because you have an additional agent, if you will, running on the endpoint, that agent can provide additional information about that agent or about that endpoint called host information profiling, which allows you to go through and have better control of your access. So a device moves off premise, it needs to have deeper inspection of that traffic while it's accessing on-prem critical assets. you could do that through GlobalProtect. So just a few of the reasons why keeping GlobalProtect in mind is definitely key as you're going through and enabling your remote workforce. So with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Dan Smith. Dan Smith, again, is one of the engineers that is based here in Southern California. He focuses strictly on state and local government, but we do have experts from across all of public sector on this call as well. So Dan is going to dive a little bit deeper into the GlobalProtect agent best practices. He has a lot of content. I will warn you up front, it is a lot of really good quality content. So again, don't feel obligated to take screenshots or anything along that line. I will go ahead and PDF this presentation and pass it out to everybody that's registered and attended for today. So with that being said, Dan, it is all yours, sir.
All right, thanks, David. Hey, thank you everybody for joining. I really appreciate it. Again, last 4 to 5 weeks, it's been crazy. People have wanted to understand how GlobalProtect works. Specifically how the agents are sent out to the users. But before I get into this, I want to take a quick step back. You know what? I want to talk about the components of GlobalProtect. First of all, there's 3 parts to GlobalProtect, right? So you got the portal, then you got the gateway, and you got the app. So those are the 3 components of GlobalProtect. The portal provides the management function for the GlobalProtect infrastructure. So really, it is the orchestration tool for all of the configurations that are passed out to the user. Every endpoint that participates in the GlobalProtect network receives its configuration from the portal. That's important to understand. So what you're seeing here is really a snapshot of the GlobalProtect agent that we pass out. So and finally, I just want to follow up with the GlobalProtect gateway. That really provides the security enforcement for the traffic that comes from the GlobalProtect app. So again, what's important here is the GlobalProtect portal is when a user authenticates the GlobalProtect portal, the portal essentially looks at this GlobalProtect agent, identifies the user, and they're based on these criteria. It could be done through user groups, it could be done through OS, and then basically it gives a configuration back to the user. And then it allows them to connect to things like external gateways and stuff. So these agents, 90% of the people that I see installing these agents, they for some reason just go with one agent, which is kind of crazy because if you think about it, agents are really, really definable, meaning that if I do a single agent, I am stuck with all these information, just user groups, any, OS, any, external, just the gateways. And as you guys probably know, a portal and a gateway can be the same device. But in larger organizations, typically the external gateways, you have multiple gateways and the portal is a centralized management that comes in. But what you're seeing here is I broke it up into 3 different agents. So based on, and this is very similar to like a firewall rule. So when the user comes in and talks to the portal, what he does is he goes through and he matches up with one of these different agents. For instance, if you're a Windows agent and you're part of any group, you'll match up and you'll get these 2 different gateways, plus you'll get a local certificate. Now, the reason I put the iOS one is because I have a customer down in San Diego, a really good customer that asked me, he basically came and said, you know what, we're starting to deploy iPads. I do want to provide them with a GlobalProtect agent. So when they're at things like airports, or if they're at like kiosks, or if they're at something like Starbucks, I want to be able to allow them to be able to turn on the GlobalProtect app, to be able to securely communicate with their internal resources. So it's very simple. And again, we support a whole bunch of things. So let's dive right into one of these agent settings. So say I'm on the Windows agent settings, and then go into that Windows settings. I do get 6 tabs, and these tabs are configurable. We're going to cover most of these right now, but we have authentication. We have configuration selection criteria, meaning that what kind of OS, what groups are on. The gateways, we have internal and external gateways. We have apps, the app. So the app configuration, what the end user sees, what we push out to the app. So when he logs in, what can he do? Can he turn off his GlobalProtect, those types of things. And finally, the HIP collection data. So this is the one that I'm not going to really cover much or I'm not going to cover at all. I just want to cover it real quick. All it is you can turn off what can be seen at the HIPs, either either in the logs or not in the logs. So you could say, I don't want to see these information from the HIPs, or I do want to see it in the firewall logs. So, you know, I am such a big advocate of multi-factor authentication. You know, it's probably the most important feature set on any kind of firewalls when you're a remote user. Something you know, something you have, and something you are. Simply, it's so easy to create multi-factor authentication, to be able to provide users secure access to it. In our configuration under authentication, we provide an easy method to be able to push out client certificates to all the clients. So if you look here, the client certificate, we have 3 ways to push it out. So local, meaning what I'm essentially doing is I'm taking a cert with a key and I'm importing it into the firewall. So when I import that into the firewall and I set it up to local, what's going to happen is when I push out this agent, I am going to install this client cert onto the endpoint. So I can do multi-factor authentication. I could do not only LDAP authentication, plus I can do cert authentication. This is just a beginning. That's a 2-factor authentication, but it could also be part of a multi-factor authentication with OTPs and those types of things. So if you guys are familiar with SCEP, which is a simple certificate enrollment protocol, another way of being able to push out certificates. But this requires you to have some kind of a PKI environment where you're going to define a URL so the user can go and enroll and get a certificate from that server. And then finally, on the bottom one, you see none. So a lot of people, when they come to me and they ask, what does none mean? Am I turning off my client certificates? No, that's not really what that means. What that means is none is I have another mechanism to be able to distribute the client certificates. For instance, I could use something like SCOM or group policies for Microsoft, be able to securely being able to push out those certificates. And then all we have to do is be able to read those certificates to be able to authenticate the users. So there's one other thing I want to cover in authentication. And you know what? This is actually pretty important. By default, when you go into authentication and config, or the config and authentication, this is disabled by default. And for good reasons. One, it's used for OTPs or multi-factor authentication. What it does, if you think about it, when a user connects up to the portal, what we do is we create a cookie, a secure cookie, and we encrypt it with the certificate, and we send it to the user. And in this case, you'll see the cookie lifetime, 15 days. This is being sent from the portal. In the gateway, we have these identical settings. So when they talk about authentication override, the gateway can actually override what the portal sends. So essentially what's happening is the portal sends a cookie to the user, and the user seamlessly logs into the gateway using an authentication or a secure authentication cookie. Hopefully that makes sense. So it's really making the user's experience better. Now let's take an example where say you set a lifetime on the portal. Say it's 15 days, but on the gateway, when the user comes into the gateway, you have it set for 8 hours. You have sensitive information on the gateway. When the user connects up, there might be payroll, there might be finance apps, all those different types of different secure things that you don't want to allow the user to continuously have an expired cookie. So what would happen is the portal or the gateway has an expiration time, let's say of 8 hours instead of days. What will happen is the cookie comes in, as long as it's within that 8 hours, the user can still log in seamlessly, like without having to do multiple logins. As soon as it expires, so 8 hours, say it comes back the next day, and now we're 24 hours. What'll happen is the gateway will take that cookie and say, you know what, it's expired. You need to re-log in. And you only need to log into the gateway. Now what happens is the gateway now updates the cookie and sends it back to the user. So now he has an updated cookie and he can use it at the portal and the gateway. But the portal one still has that lifetime of 15 hours, so he never has expired on that one. So hopefully that makes sense. So this is really about making the user's experience seamless. I like this actually. This is pretty interesting, and let me give you like an example why this is pretty important. So I'm a remote user. I'm a remote SE that works in Southern California. So there are some configurations, and I'm sure this is what our company does. When we log in and we connect up to our gateway and our portal, basically, I bet you we take this and we identify the remote users. And once we identify the remote users, I can apply different types of settings. For instance, being a remote user, there's things that we need. For instance, we need to disable split tunneling, but we need to be able to eventually, but we need local access to our resources on our local LAN. Another thing that we need with this being a remote SE is we need to be able to turn off the gateway or the GlobalProtect app. So these are settings that based on your criteria, our company could set this up, and then eventually he gives us the internal, external apps, the app settings. So we are unique to maybe the internal users or internal SEs that are in corporate office that might have a whole different criteria matching, that maybe they have to connect to an internal or external gateway right away, or an internal gateway, to be able to authenticate and also push all their different or create a secure tunnel type thing. So I just wanted to make sure you guys understand how this works. So each one of these you can have multiple criterias and determining on what the user comes in, what domain he's in, or what type of OS he is, and then you define what kind of portals or what kind of gateways they have, and what kind of app settings get pushed to your GlobalProtect client. So let's talk about these internal and external GlobalProtect gateways. And this is pretty important to understand. Everybody pretty much knows what an external one. An external one is a remote user connecting up to a firewall that resides, that has an outside interface that basically creates a VPN tunnel. So, but not a lot of people understand what an internal GlobalProtect gateway is. So think about an internal gateway as same thing. You're creating a gateway that's internal. So what happens is when a user logs in and say his GlobalProtect auto starts, it's pre-log on, what happens is it immediately tries to find the gateways that are defined in his app or agent settings. So if he has an internal one, the first thing he does is he tries to contact the internal host, and then determines that, okay, I am an internal employee, so I need to securely send my traffic by creating a tunnel to this internal gateway. Now all my information is secure through that gateway. Now I can apply all my security policies and basically protect my internal apps, basically working like a NAC. So I can do HIPS checking, I could do user ID identification, allowing specific access to applications. So again, there's two different types. Hopefully that makes sense. But now basically talk about external auto discovery. So external, very simple, like you guys like doing it right now. Basically your GlobalProtect app connects up to an external gateway. Now what happens is if you have multiple external gateways, it needs to be able to figure out what the best gateway is. And I created a chart here, a very simple diagram. So say I'm a user over here and I need a gateway. First thing I do is I talk to the portal. And the portal could be the same device as one of the gateways, or it could be a separate device. So the gateway sends me my client settings back to my GlobalProtect app, and then I communicate with the two gateways. If I have my priorities set equally, like highest and highest, basically I'm gonna pick the first one that has the best response time. If I define my priorities a little bit differently, say I have highest and high, or better yet, if I have three of them, say highest and high, what it does, it takes the response time and does an average. And then what it does is it figures out, based on the average, if the highest one is above that average response time. If it is, then it'll start choosing gateways that have a high priority or a lower priority than the highest. So that's how we determine which kind of gateways we're going to send users to. Hopefully that makes sense. It's pretty straightforward. So another thing I wanted to cover here, again, this is very similar. Gateways, one of the best practices that you can provide at the gateway level when you're defining your external ones is to be able to define it with what they call a fully qualified domain name instead of an IP address. And let me explain why this is important. So if you have a fully qualified domain name, well, first of all, your gateways can be anywhere. They could be a physical device, right? A physical hardware firewall on-prem at a data center, or it can be cloud-based devices, say AWS or Azure. So those could be also considered gateways. They could be added to your GlobalProtect infrastructures as gateways. Now, say you're in Azure and you accidentally left it to the interface to like, what is it? Not auto discovery, but basically you get a new IP address every time you shut down and bring it back up. Well, essentially what'll happen is, or if you wanted to move your gateway, say you move it from Azure over to AWS, the only thing you have to update is the certificate. You just got to move the certificate over, and the fully qualified domain name will be able to find it, access it, and be able to send users to it. It's a great way to provide this. And if you use IP addresses, you might have some issues when you're starting to use things like certificates. GlobalProtect uses a lot of certificates to be able to authenticate the users, and you can actually deny people from accessing GlobalProtect. All right. So internal. So how does internal really do? How does it work? So I kind of hit on it a little bit. But say I'm a user and I come in, I turn on my laptop. I have pre-logon. So GlobalProtect automatically goes out and with a machine cert connects up to a portal. So the portal basically says, okay, you know what? First of all, I'm going to give you my internal and external gateways. So I wanted you to go first and go try to discover your gateways. So he tries by, what he does is he does a reverse DNS lookup on this host name and this IP address to verify that if he's local or not. If he is, then what happens is he's getting sent to an internal gateway. And now everything gets tunneled through that internal gateways through source addresses. And so you can define the different types of source addresses that you want to add it to. And hopefully that makes sense. But it's a great way to be able to provide that security to those applications that are on different zones. Things that really do need security. So things like payroll, things like, I don't know, financial documents, financial servers, those types of things. Like, you need to provide granular access to those things, and you can actually tunnel everything through the internal. The thing about the internal, though, or nothing bad about the internal, but you can define an internal in a couple different ways. One is you could do it in tunnel mode with IPsec, or you could do it with HTTP or HTTPS. So different ways of doing it. And external, when you define a gateway and you connect up to the external, it always has to be tunnel, and it prefers IPsec. If it can't connect with IPsec, it'll come in with SSL.
Hey, Dan, if I could just chime in on a couple things on that too.
Sure.
So one of the nice things about internal gateways is you do have the ability to, and we do have some customers out there that actually utilize GlobalProtect gateways internally to tunnel their traffic back, right? And that would actually be an external gateway. The nice thing about internal gateways is it does everything that GlobalProtect normally would do in regards to sharing user ID information, sharing host information, profiling information, and doing that just general posture of the endpoint without actually the need to create the tunnel. So you do have both options. You can create tunnels internally, or you can not do tunnels internally. So if the device is sitting on a trusted network and you just want to collect HIP information from it, you have that ability to do that as well. So definitely a few different options you have, both tunneled and non-tunneled options.
Absolutely. All right, thanks, David. Cool. So let's talk about the connect methods. And this comes up a lot with my customers. Again, when we define our configs, our agent configs, and we push it out to the GlobalProtect clients, one of the options is connect method. So there's 4 different ways that we can connect a user, right? So user log on, always on. This is pretty self-explanatory. Basically, as the name says, as the user logs on, the GlobalProtect connects after the user logs onto the machine. So this is good when you are doing things like Windows and Mac, where you can actually pass the credentials as a single sign-on. So what'll happen is your login credentials will be used for GlobalProtect to automatically connect. So that is actually the preferred, and it's the default setting for GlobalProtect. You also have pre-log on, always on. Pre-log on basically establishes a VPN tunnel before the user logs in. So it's pretty important that in order to be able to do this, you need a PKI environment where you can install things like machine certs. So it automatically, as soon as you turn on the machine, it'll automatically go connect. Now, what are some of the use cases for pre-log on? I would say you're an administrator and you want to be able to push out updates to the machine. That'd be a great way to do it, because the user just needs to turn on the machine. You can connect, it'll connect to the portal gateway, and you have access to be able to push out updates to that machine. The other 2 are pretty self-explanatory. On demand, basically you're starting it yourself. I mean, that's great. It's great for things like if you don't really care to, or if you don't need a lot of security, say like an iPad, you can install, or an iPhone or an Android, one of those types of things. You can install it from the store and basically set up policies that said, okay, on demand, if I'm traveling with an iPad and I know I'm in an airport, maybe I want to turn it on. Maybe I want to have that secure connection. And then also pre-log on demand. Same thing as the pre-log on, but you can disable it and re-enable it yourself. So so essentially it starts up immediately and it connects with the machine cert, but then you can actually utilize, you can disable it and then do another log on demand. All right. So another thing I wanted to talk about, and this is another thing that always comes up with my customers. So, and again, it's one of the configuration that gets pushed out. So it's allow users to disable GlobalProtect. By default, when we set up one of these one of these configs, the agent configs, it is set up to allow. So the user has the ability to turn off the GlobalProtect, which in most cases, it's not a bad thing if it's not highly sensitive information. But if you're in environments where you do have sensitive information, maybe you want to change it to either disable or even better yet, which we do here at Palo Alto, we allow our SEs, our remote SEs, to be able to disable it, but we have to put in a comment. We got to say why. Maybe we're doing some testing. Maybe we want to communicate across our firewall that's on a different zone, and we need to be able to access it. And the only way we can do it is disable it, because we have split tunneling enabled, or disabling split tunneling. So things like that. And then there's also a couple other ways where you could see allow it to disable, but utilize a password. Now, when you do this, basically you're actually getting involved, the administrator. So he has to provide the password and it can define the times and stuff. I like this one with the allow ticket, and I was playing with it with a customer one time. So what it does is the user, of course, can disable it, but then he gets a ticket and he has to contact, say, support or ServiceNow or whatever, create a ticket, and he has to supply the ticket number. And what happens is the administrator or an IT folk guy creates the ticket or creates a password, gives it to him, and that password has a defined user time that he can have it disabled. As soon as that time expires, it turns back on. It's pretty cool option. So you know, we talked about this earlier. We talked about tunnel settings. Right now, what I did was I just pivoted over from, we were in the portal settings, agent settings, but now we're pivoting over to the gateway settings. So there's a lot of settings in the gateways, but the two that I want to focus on is this tunnel setting. So like David mentioned earlier, when you're internal and you connect up to an internal gateway, this tunnel mode is optional. So you can actually disable it, or you can disable IPsec and then just allow HTTP. But when you're external, tunnel is absolutely required. So there's no getting around that. And what best practices for us is that you enable IPsec. So it's always on. So it creates a secure tunnel from the client all the way down to your gateway. So this is a pretty important setting for security wise. Last thing I want to cover before I turn it over to Shane is split tunneling. And again, this is in the agent settings in the client. So best practice is split tunneling is never allowed, should never be allowed, but so there are reasons why you disable split tunneling or enable split tunneling. So by default, what we do is we deny split tunneling. So and it is best practice to be able to turn it off and be able to and again, some of the things that that we have issues with here as SEs, split tunneling is always on. In order for us to be able to get around split tunneling, we do have our security policy from our corporation is to disable the GlobalProtect client in order to be able to. But then what that requires is you're going to need to be an educated user, a GlobalProtect user, to be able to know that, you know, there could be situations where you're going to be seeing traffic that is going directly out to the internet, and you just got to be cautious. So, all right. So that is really my last slide about GlobalProtect. Now I'm going to turn it over to Shane. Unless, David, did you have anything to add?
No, great job. We have a few questions coming in, folks. Just to let you know, we do have a Q&A section at the end of the presentation, so we'll definitely be answering a majority of those live. A few of them we have typed answers to, but yeah, no. Other than that, Shane, it's all yours.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Great presentation, Dan, and thanks for the introduction, David. Appreciate everyone joining the call today. Dan, if you could go ahead and advance to the next slide. So two of the things I want to be covering today, as David mentioned in the introduction, is primarily based around the CIS 20 critical security controls. The two different parts are, one, how they can be utilized to help secure a couple of controls that will help secure your home network environment, and then also how some of the CIS controls map to GlobalProtect from a best practice assessment perspective. So those of you that aren't familiar with CIS, it's Center for Internet Security. It's a 501c3 nonprofit organization that was formed in October of 2000. One of the things that they're most known for currently is the CSC's abbreviation is the critical security controls, or the top 20 people typically reference. This is a publication for best practice guidelines for computer security. So most people are familiar with the top 20 critical security controls that was originally developed by SANS Institute back in 2008, but CIS has since taken them over in 2005 and has been managing and overseeing them since then. I've been working with the critical security controls for some time now, even back a few years ago, running the Security Operations Center for a utility company. I was able to help develop the guide for industrial control systems for the top 20 critical security controls. So it's another free resource available through Center for Internet Security. Why are these controls important? Not just from a corporate environment, but today I'm also going to mention some of the controls that are important for securing your home network, but leveraging cyber offense to inform cyber defense, focusing mainly on high payoff areas. Also ensuring security investments are focused to counter highest threats, maximizing use of automation to enforce security controls, and then using consensus process to collect best ideas. Next slide, if you could, Dan. So on the left side, you can see a list of the top 20 controls broken down into 3 different categories. 1 through 6 are tagged as the basic controls, 7 through 16 are foundational, and then 17 through 20 are organizational controls. I'll be doing a follow-up webinar down the road to go into more detail on all 20 controls and their subcontrols. So keep an eye out for that in the future. So there's 4 main controls that CIS calls out for helping to secure your home network. Control number 1, 2, 8, and 11. I'll kind of go into those in a little bit more detail. Also, as David mentioned, these slides will be distributed. So the hyperlink to access the 20 critical security controls is listed on this slide for your reference. Next slide, if you could, Dan. So just to kind of touch on the 4 critical security controls for helping to secure your home environment. Control number 1, inventory and control of hardware assets. Again, this is extremely important in the corporate environment, but also think about your home environment. You know, essentially, how are you able to protect something or apply security controls to something if you don't know that exists? So think about not just all your connected devices from an IoT standpoint. So laptops, printers, mobile devices, smart TVs, Alexa, Google Home, etc., but also devices that aren't connected as well. So think about previous devices that are no longer in use, no longer connected. You know, maybe old cell phones, old laptops, or just devices that aren't actually connected to the internet. Making sure you have a solid inventory of all those devices, know what they are, and then from that standpoint, know how to better control them. And again, not just the devices themselves, but also, what are the specific use case for that device? So think about, people that are teleworking now will have a, personal laptop or desktop, and then a corporate laptop or desktop. So based on that, you would essentially want to apply, different controls. Should those devices be able to talk to each other? Think in terms also of, devices accessed by children versus adults, and the different controls that would be needed to be applied to those different types of devices. And then also, take into consideration the aspect of connectivity. So should those devices be able to talk to each other? Essentially an iPad that is used for video and education for children, also accessing your corporate device that you're using for teleworking. So similar concept from an inventory perspective is not just the hardware aspect, but also the software aspect. So essentially understanding all of the applications and different type of software that are running on your various devices. So again, think in terms of what should be running from a software or application standpoint on your corporate laptop versus your personal laptop versus your mobile devices you might be connecting with. And again, even think about IoT-based devices and what's actually running on them. So becoming more intimate and familiar with software and applications that are running on these devices to help you understand what's actually there and then apply the appropriate controls as needed. CIS control number 8 is another one to apply to your home security network, and this is essentially malware defense, not just from an endpoint security standpoint, but also from a network standpoint. Making sure that you have strong, again, endpoint and network security that's updated regularly and continuously checking for vulnerabilities and threats, extremely important as well. Then also the last control that's called out for helping to secure your home network is control number 11, which is secure configuration for network devices such as firewalls, routers, and switches. So just making sure that, again, think about your wireless router at home, making sure that device itself is secure. Typically, a lot of newer wireless routers today will have some type of firewall that you're able to enable, and then different levels of security controls based on that firewall, whether it's just basic or advanced. But even more importantly, just think about changing some of the default settings. So not utilizing the default SSID from a wireless perspective to broadcast that information for people to connect to. make sure that's changed to something unique, but then also, and especially, default passwords as well. You can Google anytime, any type of model of, home router, or even, corporate device, routers, switches, firewall, etc. And Google will happily tell you the full list of all default username and passwords you can use to connect the devices. So make sure that that information is unique and changed ASAP when something stood up in your environment. Next slide, please, Dan. So Palo Alto customers should be somewhat familiar with, it's called a BPA. It's a best practice assessment. And this is an best practice assessment. It's a set of 200 plus automated checks run against our next generation firewalls to tell you whether you pass or fail these various checks based on what Palo Alto considers best practices. So again, this is a free service available to next generation firewall customers. Customers are able to run this on their own. They're able to utilize their Palo Alto SEs to assist with this, or even partners as well. But out of those 200 plus checks, there's 16 that are catered towards GlobalProtect, and primarily between portals and gateways. So here's a list of the 16 different best practices checks that align to GlobalProtect. Not going to go through all of them in detail, but just to point out a couple features of the benefits of a BPA. One, it not only will show you a comparison of where you rank from a best practices standpoint against similar industries. So if you were in higher education, for example, doing a comparison of your specific best practices assessment check versus the average across all higher ed, whether it's something like we're talking about today, like GlobalProtect best practices, or maybe what other similar industries, or again, higher education would be doing from a SSL decryption standpoint, implementation of application ID, URL filtering, threat prevention, etc. So it shows you kind of where you rank against the rest of the industry. Also, a big benefit of the best practice assessment is it will also capture the data each time you run a best practice assessment. So you can start with a baseline and then show an increase in security maturity over time. So typically recommend that these are run quarterly for next generation firewall customers, but again, it's freely available and you can run them as frequently if you want, even if you want to run them weekly or even down to daily. So some of the benefits of the best practice assessment is it will also align with what it does from a assessment standpoint to 4 different categories. So the capability column, you can see almost right in the middle. It will map to the various categories based on CISSP. Class will map to the different type of control it is, whether it's technical, operational, or management. Control category is mapping to NIST, particularly NIST Special Publication 853. And then what we're talking about today, it will also show the best practices checks, how they align to the critical security controls, and in particular, the particular sub-control that it will actually map to. Next slide, if you could, Dan. So there are 3 different, there's 2 different critical security controls over 3 different sub-controls that map to the 16 checks for GlobalProtect through the best practice assessment. This one in particular is calling out 4.5. It's a sub-control of CIS Control 4, which is controlled use of administrative privileges, primarily based on multi-factor authentication and administrative access. Next slide, Dan. And then the other control is called out as CIS Control 14, which is controlled access based on need to know. And the 2 sub-controls that are called out in the 16 GlobalProtect best practice checks are 14.2 and 14.4. And I'll touch base a little bit on these on the next slide, if you could advance, Dan. So one of the big benefits, again, of the best practices check is I kind of accented the blue question mark at the top. So when you run a best practice assessment check in your environment, the HTML output version will be sprinkled with these blue check marks throughout it, and it's a great resource just for additional information. So the question mark will give more details based on 3 different categories. So it'll give you a description of each specific check it's running, rationale as to why it's important, why we think it's beneficial to be a best practices check, and then also any reference URLs that are associated with it. So those 16 GlobalProtect best practices checks we looked at before, it'll give you, the reasoning behind each specific check and why it's running, not just give you a pass or fail. So definitely a lot of useful information in a BPA. And then from each check perspective, it'll give you a simple, green check mark or red X saying whether you pass or fail that specific check. And then again, utilizing that blue question mark will give you the reasoning and rationale behind each check and what you can do to essentially move forward with a pass. So this isn't all 16 checks as mentioned previously. This is an aggregated view of some of the best practices based on portals and gateway from GlobalProtect perspective running a BPA. So the first one is essentially just running you're setting to have a minimal version of SSL TLS service profile. So at this point in time, it's currently recommending the minimum should be TLS version 1.2. Dan touched pretty heavily on multi-factor authentication. So this is extremely important from a GlobalProtect portal client authentication perspective, among other things. Use of a trusted root certificate. This is what primarily is going to verify the identity of GlobalProtect portals and gateways. Not allowing GlobalProtect app to save credentials. So when user credentials are readily available, unauthorized users may be able to gain direct access to sensitive resources and confidential information. We know pretty much everybody loves to save passwords to make authentication login easy, but not necessarily a best practice for doing so. Use of internal host detection. This is to determine whether an endpoint is inside the enterprise, so it's actually classified as being internal to the network, and then can connect to internal gateways versus being outside of the enterprise. Disable GlobalProtect app for certain timeouts only. So this is obviously a business decision if you want to allow employees to or customers to have the ability to actually disable that app and bypass those security controls. Dan gave a couple great use cases to why people would want to have the ability to be able to disable that, whether it's for testing, troubleshooting, etc. But this best practices check is essentially saying that if you do allow people to disable that feature, you set a certain time limit for having it reconnect. You don't want people to get in the habit of connecting remotely from their home devices, and step number 1 they do before anything is disable their GlobalProtect app and then never enable it again. So essentially, all the security controls you would have in place from that perspective would essentially be disabled. So setting some type of disable timeout is definitely a best practice. Enable GlobalProtect to collect HIP data. Both David and Dan touched on this before. HIP checks are host information profile. This essentially gives you the ability to interact with devices for checking things like security patches, antivirus definitions, disk encryption, validating what software is installed. Is there a firewall enabled? And then even from a mobility standpoint, are you connecting back to the corporate environment with a mobile device that has infected malware apps? Is that phone jailbroken? Is there a passcode enabled, etc.? So it just allows a more detailed check and inspection of various devices. It's called HIP checks utilizing GlobalProtect. Use a satellite trusted root certificate just to verify gateway server certificates and establish secure VPN tunnel connections to GlobalProtect gateways. Satellite trusted root CA would come into play for like larger scale VPN setups. Include the 0.0.0.0 access route for split tunnel configuration. This indicates you are including all destination subnets or address objects. And then last two checks based on satellite tunnel configuration, replay attack detection, and tunnel monitoring. So replay attack detection to protect against unauthorized users, maliciously retransmitting valid data, primarily from a user credential standpoint. And then tunnel monitoring. So if a satellite location is unable to connect to a GlobalProtect gateway, you can enable the satellite to fail over to another gateway or wait for the tunnel to recover using a tunnel monitoring profile. So just wanted to give a quick run through of how the CIS controls help to secure a home network and how they align to GlobalProtect from a best practices perspective. Happy to take any questions. Other than that, I'll turn it back over to you, David.
Cool, thank you so much. Appreciate that. So same slide that we had on the last webinar, but kind of what's next, right? Just so everybody has the references to the GlobalProtect quick configs and architectures, as well as what we call the holy grail of GP resources, right? Couple quick links there for you. As well as always, right? Palo Alto Networks, your favorite partner and third parties are definitely here to help. So feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to provide you any guidance that you need there. And as well, if you don't know who your Palo Alto Networks team is, rapid-response@paloaltonetworks.com. They'll be able to look that up for you. Or you can always just shoot me an email too if you have my email information, which I think many of you do. A big shout out and thank you to Daniel Smith, Shane Markley, and Aaron McAllister for all the help and for honestly doing the heavy lifting on this webinar. Thank you all for joining. I greatly appreciate it. And again, Dan, Aaron, and Shane, thank you so much for your time too. Other than that, everybody enjoy and stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, David, for presenting that great webinar. I will be adding a Q&A session separately, so look in the description below. I will add links to the Q&A. As always, we welcome all questions and comments below. If you enjoyed watching this video, please give it a thumbs up and please subscribe to be notified of all of our new videos coming from the live community. Thanks again and have a great day.